I am live. It is Wednesday morning, the 6th of September, and I am reading out of Eyes of Horus. It is a book by Joan Marshall Grants, who was a seer. She was able to remember her past incarnations, and it was all quiet a minute ago. And she is writing about her life as Ra-Up, a male, 3,500 years BC, and I'm in chapter 4 of this book now. And the book is called The Eyes of Horus, and this is the third chapter of the fourth part of this book. First, greeting. After hearing Heliokios in audience 3 times, I felt confident in my ability to pass an accurate judgment on him. This I sent to Rodan by the first of the secret messages dispatched to Horus-A. I gave a detailed summary of all the judgments I had heard Heliokios deliver, and added certain extracts from our conversations, which I considered threw further light on his character. Through Sebek I had learned that all the members of his household found him a just and considerate master, and it was obvious that Dacleon had a real affection for him. So I suggested that although he could not be allowed to hold office after the Watchers came into authority, he should be permitted to retain his country estate, or such portion of it as could be worked by those of his servants who might wish to remain with him, where he could live in comfortable seclusion. By the time I had finished this report that filled several of the long, narrow strips of papyrus with which I had come amply provided, I wished I had been able to bring a scribe with me, for I found the creation of so many writing signs exceedingly laborious. I was grateful for the tradition by which no one of noble birth lacked a scribe to translate their messages into the slow medium of reed and papyrus. As the day passed, I began to wonder when I should meet someone else who had sufficient strength of character either to become a watcher or to deserve banishment from Egypt, for I thought it unwise to let Heliokios guess that my interest was not centered in the entertainment with which he provided me so lavishly. The first few occasions when I met those who in years were my contemporaries, I found amusing enough, for they were so unlike any people I had met before. The girls were gay and light-hearted, but the moment I tried to turn the conversation out of the channel of flattery, they left me to seek someone more congenial to their taste. The young men either belonged to the royal bodyguard, in which case they were preoccupied with their muscular perfection and could talk of nothing except sports, or else they were nearly as slender as their sisters and as lavish with eye paint. Some of these delicate creatures were high in favour with the women, who surrounded them with twittering cries when they declaimed a poem or would accompany them on the harp when, yielding to welcome persuasion, they consented to sing. I met several of the younger officials. Most of them had only nominal duties, which chiefly consisted in providing the background of court life. They had been trained to this since they were children, and having from their earliest years been taught the world and gesture suitable to each occasion, they seemed almost incapable of thinking as individuals. To watch any such entertainment from a distance would be to see some of the most handsome men in Egypt, smiling in the company of her most beautiful daughters. But shut your eyes while you were amongst them, and there would be little to tell you who was speaking. So stereotyped was their conversation, even when it was frivolous. Nor could it be easy to distinguish whether the party was today's or belonged to last week, or yet was another which time concealed until the following day. There were so few topics which interested them that when another was added to their little store, they were as greedy for it as orphan pigs for milk. It might be the most trivial of happenings, but somehow they would weave it into a net of gossip with which they hoped to catch a few moments' laughter. I remember how one day they could talk of nothing except the rumor that a red-haired daughter had been born to the wife of the keeper of the royal quarries, a woman who had made herself unpopular by having a tongue so venomous she had been nicknamed the granddaughter of the sand snake. I heard it myself from the woman who is giving suck to the child. Nanu says her mother told her that neither family has the red strain. Another girl giggled and said knowingly, "I wonder why the emissary from Minoas noticed her. I always thought her very insignificant." "Yes, of course, he has red hair. But did she ever meet him?" The fifth girl said in tones of mock solemnity, "When I bear a child, I shall at least admit to have met his father." This was answered by a small woman whose rounded prettiness held a warning of the fact that time was holding like a cloak to wrap her in. "I expect you will, dear Berikang. You have always been so quick to notice a new man." This last remark caused great amusement, and I think that if the two women had had the freedom of their sisters of the marketplace, they would have scratched each other's faces instead of having to content themselves with an acid smile. Sebek found those first days more profitable than I, for the servants who came in attendance on our guests were entertained by Dakleon, and were apt to speak freely of their masters, especially as Sebek was careful to see that the one to whom he was talking never lacked beer or mead to loosen his tongue. Some of them were loyal or boasted of the one whose device they wore, for by so doing they enhanced their own prestige among the other servants. But there were others who, finding in Sebek a sympathetic ear, whispered of the injustices, and said they only worked in the royal city so as to be able to provide their families with food. Many of them came from the caste who in the Oryx would have owned several fields, but perhaps as many as 10 cattle in their own right. But, for reasons I was to discover later, their land had become forfeit, because they were unable to meet the heavy taxes imposed by Pharaoh, and now they had to come to have only a little more freedom than the foreign slaves. The information that Sebek was able to gather was fragmentary, but it was sufficient for us to make an additional list of people whom it would be necessary to judge when we knew more about them. I had been 12 days in the house of the two winds when Heliokios told me I had been invited to a banquet at the house of Ramaios, keeper of the royal treasure. "He holds the gold seal and the pharaoh," said Heliokios. "Next to the vizier, he is the most powerful officer. Ramaios is respected for his integrity. It is said he is the only man in the royal nomes whose favour cannot be purchased, though others say he is a fool not to profit more widely from his opportunities. I'm afraid his entertainments have not a reputation for gaiety, though the food is renowned and the wine rivaled only by the finest in the royal cellars. But he has a daughter, Mary Ososis." He paused and looked at me quizzically. "From what I have seen of you, you are not interested in women, or have you left your heart in the Oryx?" Mimu gave me the clue to an answer which could easily satisfy him. She was crouched over a bowl of fruit, wondering which to snatch first. "It is not that I am indifferent, it is only that, like Mimu, I am slow in making my choice." As it was a formal banquet, I took Sebek with me as a cupbearer. The house of the Lord of the Golden Seal was beyond the avenue of ram sphinxes, and its garden went down to the river where Ramaios had a private landing stage. I knew this because the house had been pointed out to me from the river the day before. I decided to walk to the banquet, for the shady streets were pleasant after the heat of the day, and I was weary of the inactivity which attendance on Heliokios often imposed on me. It was sunset when I reached the house, and I saw that many guests had already arrived. Litter bearers were gathered in the shadows of the entrance courtyard, watching their fellow runners set down new arrivals before the three wide steps which led up to the high doorway of the main entrance. 12 Nubian servants, so well matched in their magnificent stature that each might have been the twin brother of the man next to him, lined the way to the banqueting hall. Their kilts were of heavy linen dyed a bright, brilliant yellow, and they wore the Sphinx headdress striped in vermilion and yellow, the colours only borne by members of a household of a keeper of the royal seal. Ramaios was seated at the centre of a long table set on a raised dais at the far end of the room. On each side of him were 3 vacant chairs in which would sit the principal guests. He wore a wig of the type favoured by Holyokios. His eyes were long and narrow, and his unshaven brows were like rods of charcoal, seeming too boldly drawn for that thin, expressionless face, with its high-bridged nose and withdrawn mouth. On the table in front of him was a gold wine cup with 2 handles. From this each guest in turn must drink, as he couples his name with that of his host in pledge of friendship. But when the guest is a woman, the host takes the cup and drinks in her name. In accordance with custom, Sebek held the cup for me to drink, a ceremony which was commemorated, that Pharaoh, who had been stabbed by the king of a conquered people while drinking the wine in which the oath of fealty was to have been sealed. To the formal phrases, Ramaios added a few words in which he told me that, as the son of my father, I should always be a welcome guest, for they had been friends since, as young men, they had gone on a famous lion hunt, in which father had vanquished 3 lions. The younger guests seemed to be gathering at the far end of the hall, but as I hoped to meet someone who would prove to be of interest to the eyes of Horus, I avoided them and took one of the 2 stools which were set a little apart from the others and partly hidden by a pillar. This being an occasion of formality, the host and his chief guest sat at the high table, while the rest of the company chose their own companions, and went to whichever of the group seats ranged on 2 sides of the room they preferred, and these groups varied from 2 to as many as 5 or 6. The second role of the cupbearer was to bring wine and food to his master, or rather to tell the servants which of the many dishes would be likely to please him. Of these dishes there was a wide variety, several kinds of fish, bird, and game, and such additions as eggs stuffed with foreign herbs, pâté of duck's liver, pomegranates split open and soaked in sweet wine, and ripe melons filled with new dates, and sprinkled with shredded almonds. And I knew there would be dishes I had never tasted before, for Holyokios was not one who praised another man's cooks without reason. The great height of the room seemed to subdue the sound of voices, or else there was none of the spontaneity I had found at other houses. I wondered if this was due to Ramaios, or only because most of the people here were of an older generation that had met previously. By now 5 of the 6 chairs beside Ramaios were filled. I recognized the captain of the royal bodyguard, very splendid in his glittering insignia, and beside him his wife, who looked young enough to be his daughter, whose mother was a Babylonian princess. Sebek whispered that another of the guests of honor was the architect who had designed the city, and was reported to be close to the royal ear, and that the man on the left of our host was the governor of the northern garrison. To my annoyance, the stool next to me was taken by a man only a little older than myself, who, even before he told me, I knew by his insignia to be the leader of 100 from the same garrison as the man who sat with Ramaios. It was of the royal city I wanted information, and it was unlikely he could give me any, but I consoled myself with the knowledge that when the lengthy meal was over I should be free to mingle with the other guests, among whom I had already seen several acquaintances. The only animation came from the group of young people at the end of the room, and I began to regret I had not joined them. Until then I had only noticed them as a moving pattern of bright colours, but now I saw that Ramaios was looking rather impatiently in their direction, as though he had uttered a command. A girl, who had until then had been hidden from me by her companions, walked swiftly up the centre of the floor to take her place beside him. She was tall, nearly as tall as I, and her body under its long pleated dress of green mist linen was very slender. Her hair was a vivid black, and she wore it cut to shoulder length, held back from her wide brow by a wreath of gold and enamel flowers of most delicate craftsmanship. I tried to recall where I had seen her before. That I had seen her before, I was sure, but where? How could I have confused her with any of the other girls I had seen in the royal city? She was as different to them as the notes of a night-singing bird are to the screeching of an angry parrot. The man next to me was also staring at her. Who would have thought Ramoises had such a beautiful daughter? They say she is very ambitious and refuses to choose a husband so long as either of the princes has not taken his royal wife. I tried to stop thinking about her. What should I be interested in the ambitions of a daughter of Ramois? I had never been unfaithful to the girl beyond the river, and no beauty save hers could offer me temptation. The soldier told me he had just returned from a foray in the eastern desert. By the manner in which he told his story, I realized it was only a little band of robbers, 12 in all, whom he, with his 100 to help him, had killed, to cure them of raiding flocks in the high pasture. I tried to give him my attention, but my thoughts refused to be withdrawn from the girl who sat at the high table. I was glad I was in the shadow of a pillar, for it allowed me to watch her without appearing too obvious. Every gesture she made, every turn of her head, poised like a lotus on the stalk of her neck, made her more familiar to me. I seemed to hear my own voice saying, "Of course I shall know you when I see you. I will go to every nome in every country, look in the fields and in the streets of great cities until I find you." And a voice which answered, "How will you know me when you don't know what I am going to look like? I may be old or fat or have a squint. How could you love me if I were ugly?" Certainty came like a sudden shaft of light. I had known her almost as soon as I saw her, and I knew her name even before I knew she bore it. Mary or Sosis. Mary, for which the writing sign is beloved. In some remote distance I heard the soldiers recounting yet another exploit, and the few words in which brevity must have linked hands with discourtesy which came forth from my mouth in reply. But they belonged to the shell of Ra, for his spirit followed his eyes, so that between Ramois and his daughter there stood a third, though neither saw him. I found myself united again with the outer Rahab, only when, at a sign from her father, she came down from the dais to go with him from group to group, exchanging a few words with every guest. I noticed that she stood beside him, I noticed that the stool beside me had been vacated, and I saw the soldier had joined 2 other men on the opposite side of the room. They stared at me as though he had been telling them I was either drunk or the biggest dullard he had ever been his misfortune to meet. I looked round for Sebek to find he had gone to seek refreshment, and listened to the gossip of other cupbearers. Would she remember my name? She had promised to recognize me when we met. What should I say to her to show that I too remembered? Her father paused to talk with some people further down the room, and she came on alone. I heard a woman wish her joy on her anniversary. "How quickly you children grow up. It seems only yesterday I thought I brought you a wooden duck to play with, and now tomorrow you will be 16. I stood waiting for her. She gave me the first greeting, and I could not find words to answer. Then she put her hand to her eyes as though she had suddenly come into a bright light and was dazzled. "How stupid of me," she said, confused. "I've forgotten your name. For a moment I did not recognize you. Surely you have been our guest before. Forgive me for my discourtesy in giving you the first greeting. I am not usually so forgetful. We first met in a great avenue beyond the river." "The avenue leading to the palace? That isn't beyond the river." I wondered if she were teasing me again, as she had done when I became an oryx. To show her I remember, I said, "Have you forgotten the oryx?" Again she pretended not to know what I meant. Or did she misunderstand? "The oryx, of course, you are Ra-Ab-Hotep, son of the oryx. Now I know. We have not met before, for my father told me you were but newly arrived in the city, and I've never been to the south." Yet the message of her eyes denied her words, and as I gave her farewell, my heart was singing, for I had found that a dream could live on my side of the river. Well, that was a lovely chapter. Have a good Wednesday.